are good. Good evening, everyone. So we're going to get down to work because we've got a lot of material to cover. As you can see, our topic today is Jewish history. This is impossible to cover all of Jewish history in an hour. So we're only going to cover sort of the broadest outline. But it's rather important because next week we're going to cover the worst bits. Next week we're going to look into why we're now in a period known as the 3 weeks, which is a period of semi-mourning that's leading up towards the commemoration of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, which is the saddest day in the entire Jewish calendar. So in order to make sense of that, you need to have the big picture view of all of Jewish history. We've talked about different slices of Jewish history over the last, this is the 30th class, but this is going to be the big picture. So we'll go through. It's going to seem way too fast because it is. And you can stop me for questions, but if the questions are you want more detail, write down what you want more detail, and I'll give you some directions of how to fill in the gaps afterwards, because we don't have time to take too many detours. Good? Okay. In the beginning, we got to go back to the beginning. When I say we're doing Jewish history, I mean we're starting at the beginning, because understanding how Judaism views its story really does need an understanding of how the story begins as a Jewish story. So obviously we could discuss the Big Bang, we could discuss 14 billion years ago, or however long it might have been, and that's great. It is true, and something that most Jews do believe in. We don't believe in only 5,779 literal, 365, 24-hour days, year-old Earth. On the other hand, as we frame the story, we do need to use the source text of how it describes what creation means, and therefore our place in creation. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Rather important sentence, not just because it starts the Torah, but because it tells us that we believe the universe isn't an accident. We believe that the universe is not just something that happened. We believe the universe is something that was deliberately made in order for it to be able to be what it is. Now, what it is and why it is something we'll sort of untangle as we go along. But that beginning idea that there was a creator and the universe wasn't an oops, that's a very important point to start from, and one that unfortunately a lot of people don't always agree with. God created the human in his image. In God's image, he created him, male and female, he created them. Would not get good points for English grammar. It sounds much better in the Hebrew. You just have to trust me. But again, right off the bat from the book of Genesis, this is letting us know that not only is the universe a God's creation, but that humanity is also something that was deliberately, specifically created. And in particular, mankind was created not only as male and female, meaning that both genders were created, women were not an afterthought, as some people interpret incorrectly, but that we were created in God's image. Doesn't mean God has a body. In fact, the word that's used for image here, B'Tselmo, his image, is not really about creating a 3D representation. It is about the identity, the characteristics, the properties. There is a similarity between us and God that is different than between other animals and God. And that is what the Torah is trying to draw to our attention, that humanity alone, among all of the created things that we've bumped into, has a special connection to that which is spiritual and divine, which the rest of creation doesn't quite have. Right? They obviously have a connection because they were created, but not quite the same. The Lord formed the human from the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living creature. In this one sentence, we see the dual nature of humanity that makes it special. For no other creature do we get exactly this type of description. We are made from the earth. That means we are made of material things. What we would say in the modern world, we are made of atoms and we are made of molecules. We are not made out of some special substance different than the rest of the world. We are very much animals of this world. We are creatures of this world. You might say poetically, we are flesh and blood. But we are also something that has had a breath of life blown into us, and that is the spirit, the soul, whatever you would like to call it. Judaism talks about the ruach, the neshama, the nefesh, 3 different words that describe different aspects of our spirit. That is what creates us as something different than not only a table, but also different than a dog or a cat. Right? Our spirit is different in a qualitative sense. And that is going to be the foundation for our story. You'll notice for all of this that this is so far not a uniquely Jewish story. Judaism believes this about everyone on earth. We may have eventually our own branch into a particular story of the Jewish people, but so far we are talking about all humans of all types. Judaism believes very strongly that all humans share this common ancestry, and the ancestry is not just about we all came from a guy named Adam and a lady named Eve, but the ancestry being we all created by God in God's image in an equal way. Good so far? Okay. The Lord said, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. This is the old eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Not an apple. That's a much later description. Early scholars hypothesized it might have been grapes, because if you eat too many grapes, meaning wine, you end up making bad choices. Others said it might have been figs, because after all, God used fig leaves to give us clothing after this. But we really don't know what the fruit was. It may have been a unique species, or it may have been, as Rambam, Maimonides, the great scholar, said, a metaphor for the idea that at this moment, what we did was we decided that we would be responsible for choosing. This is what it means partly to be in God's image, right? The Lord said, see, they have become like one of us, meaning we are now choosing our path and not like the animals around us. Right? No offense to all the dogs and cats I know and love, but they don't sit and wonder about the moral implications of what they're doing. Right? A dog thinks about whether he can get away with stealing the meat. He doesn't actually think about whether it's right or wrong or moral to steal the meat. It's just what a dog does. Humans, on the other hand, have that capacity. Some humans don't bother thinking about it and act with about as much thought as an animal. Some animals seem to have even more thought than some humans, but we have the capacity for being able to make those decisions, for being able to make that kind of thinking. And that, computer, don't be mean. That, okay. Why, you really want to go into screensaver? Okay. That is something that now makes us unique, not only because we were created with this earthy spiritual side, but we've also now have this capacity for a chosen path. Although this does mean we don't get to live in the garden anymore, which means we don't just walk through the world blind like an animal, which seems fine as long as things are going fine. It does mean, however, that we are fulfilling our destiny of being like more God-like than any other creature, because we now get to choose our destiny. That's going to come back over and over again as we go through our story. The first example, however, is the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Surely if you do well, there will be lifting up. But if you do not do well, sin crouches at the door. Its longing is for you, yet you can master it. This becomes the motif for really the rest of the Bible. If people ask what's the plot of the Bible, the plot is not just a whole bunch of stuff happened. The plot is this tension within humanity of choosing to do right and choosing to avoid doing wrong. And how well do we do that? And what happens when we fail to do that? The first real example we get after the Garden of Eden story is the story of Cain and Abel, where jealousy between two brothers leads to the first murder. The particulars of the story are less important than this idea that God is sharing with us that this is the existential crisis that we all face. We exist, but how do we choose to exist? We already know we have the capacity of choice. What choices will we make? And we have the ability to overcome sin. This is very important theologically later when Christianity tries to argue that we don't. But in Judaism, we believe from day one, we have the ability to either avoid sin in the first place or to fix it when we make mistakes. And that, again, becomes one of those underlying themes that go throughout the entire story. Good? All right, let's roll on. Noah, skipping ahead 10 generations. The Lord saw the evil of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him in his heart. Now, we'll talk another time, or you can check out my YouTube videos on understanding God, that God doesn't actually have emotions, but God, the Torah often speaks about God as though God did, because it makes it easier for us to begin to at least relate to and understand God. That Understanding God series is about 3+ hours, so we're not going to go down that detour tonight. But what we do get here is this problem that though we have the capacity for choosing good over evil, there is a tendency at different points in our history to choose wrong. And this story of Noah is a place where we are seeing the problems when everybody is choosing the wrong path all at the same time. So these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God, and with you I will establish my covenant. Meaning what God is saying is that you are the best I can find right now. And with you I'm going to establish my covenant. However, what was important was that God said after the flood, no more floods. The story of Noah is not just there to tell us about animals and floods and all of that good stuff, although it makes for great animation and good pictures. The story of Noah is there to tell us about God proving to us that God will not do that again. God is not into the destruction of the world business. God is not going to clean up humanity's mess by wiping the world clean and starting over again from a good person. God is instead recognizing that you can start with a good person and you're still going to end up in 10 generations with not so great people. So therefore, you just have to work with what you've got. And God then is showing that it's not about the world being fixed by God. It's about the world being fixed by us living up to our potential. So far, so good. Skipping ahead. 10 generations again. And yes, that is not a coincidence. 10 generations from Adam and Eve to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. This is showing ages of humanity's development. And again, at the time of Abraham, we see it described in the Torah a world that is not what you would call a moral place. We have the story of the Tower of Babel, where people wouldn't even work together if they had to do the difficult task of learning a new language, which, come on, really? We also hear about great idolatry having displaced the worship of God across the world. Again, within the Torah story, if all of humanity began by understanding God, then why would you end up worshiping sticks, stones, sun, the moon, and all the other things? And the fact is that that is a very natural progression for people if they're not being careful. Most people will end up gravitating towards something they can see, they can touch, and more importantly, they can make and control, because that is a very satisfying feeling of giving yourself some illusion of in-chargeness when you're inside a chaotic world, a world that seems much bigger than you, a world that seems often unfair to you. And rather than looking to yourself and your community for how you can make the world better, someone else, thank you, it's much easier to simply say, I'm going to make a statue, and then the statue is going to do what I say. And I'll call the statue God because otherwise it won't have power. But really, this is about the self-deception. Most people don't worship idols nowadays, but you will find that many other people do seek to have things in their lives that give them the illusion of control, that give them the illusion that they're the ones in charge. We've created a lot of technology that lets us schedule and manage our lives better than ever before. We create a lot of things like bank accounts that we think as long as it gets to a certain number, or if I have a certain type of house, or if I have a certain type of car, that my life is in my hands. The truth of the matter is it doesn't work like that. Is the door still unlocked? I don't hope you didn't lock her out. We're good. Okay, so along comes this guy named Abraham. And here we're going to switch to the Bible's story recount of this time period. This is from the book of Nehemiah in English, chapter 9. And in it, we do a little bit of a synopsis within Judaism's own lens. So he says, you alone are the Lord, meaning there is only this God. You made the heavens, the highest heavens, and all their hosts, the earth and everything upon it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrate themselves before you. You are the Lord God who chose Abram. That was Abraham's original name. Now, what we're getting in the summary is what we just talked about in our previous synopsis of creation. But it's also a reminder that in the ancient world, this was not a universal opinion. In the ancient world, most people by this point believed that there was one God for the ocean, one God for bears, one God for the forest, one God for a mountain, and maybe even one God for this mountain and one God for this river. And that division of the world also allowed people to see a division of people, Because after all, if there's one God for bears, then there's probably also one God for the Chaldeans, and one God for the Edomites, and one God for the Assyrians. And therefore, we're not all from the same source. And Judaism, of course, pushes back against that. Everything was created by God from the top to the bottom and everything in the middle. And we know that is very powerful of then why God chose Avram, because Avram seemed to understand this. And he brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. This is in modern-day Iraq, down near the south, near the Kuwait border, and changed his name to Abraham. Finding his heart true to you, you made a covenant with him to give the land. So this becomes then the dual promise, the covenant of the relationship with God and the covenant of the relationship with the land of Israel. And that becomes then Abraham's inheritance. And Abraham then sets about building a family. Now, you'll notice this is a huge shift. Up to this point, for the last 20 generations, we've been talking about everybody on earth. We zoomed in, but we were basically talking about all of the people of the world. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about one guy, and then looking very closely at his kids, his family dynamic, and what's going on there. This seems to be a shift in the plot. Not a shift in the plot. God, of course, still cares about the rest of the world. But this is where we begin to get the particular plot that is going to be the story of the Jewish people. Abraham is going to be the founder of many nations, but in particular, he's going to be the founder of the Jewish people through his grandson, Jacob. And so we need to see a little bit more closely what's going on in him and his life and why that leads to Judaism and what that tells us about Judaism. So the whole beginning of the story of Abraham, the whole first 3 generations, is all about the family not sticking together. But it is always about what is affectionately called the lonely man of faith. Poor Abraham has this dream, he has this vision, he has this calling, and he tries to build up his family, but his nephew Lot, who is with him, doesn't stick around. He ends up going down to Sodom and Gomorrah, and we all know how that turns out. Not such a good occasion. Then more generations come along. He gets his first son Ishmael, and then his next son Isaac, and they cannot live and coexist together in his household. So Ishmael is sent off. He almost ends up sacrificing Isaac. And then the next generation comes with 2 new sons, Jacob and Esau. They can't get along with each other. And so Esau ends up being sent away. Jacob runs away, returns, but again, it's not a family continuation. 3rd generation, this is the generation of what we call the 12 tribes. Looks like it's going to fall apart again, because after all, you have the brothers selling Joseph into slavery. If you've never seen Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, it's worth watching. It's not exactly accurate, but it's a fun retelling of the story. But rather than following the predictable pattern, it comes back and they reunify. And there is reconciliation and there is forgiveness. And that reunification, that ability to maintain yourself as a family, even after you've done horrible things to each other, through the process of apology and forgiveness and making amends, that then becomes what strengthens us into what will grow to be a nation. Because before this, every generation we were bleeding people off, and that meant we never had a chance to grow. Right? If you've got 2 kids and 1 leaves, well, you're back to 1 person again. You got 2 kids and 1 leaves, you're back to 1 person again. You don't have the building process that a family should have. And so by this process of repentance and forgiveness within the family can start growing into something that's meaningful. This then is taking us all the way back to that whole beginning of creation story, where what happens when you make mistakes? Do you double down on them or do you fix them? We now see that we have a family, not only as individuals, that is willing to fix the mistakes they make rather than just reinforcing or repeating them. Make sense so far? Okay. That means we are now stuck in Egypt, as everybody knows. But thankfully, again, Nehemiah continues, you took note of our father's affliction in Egypt and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds. That's the parting of the sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all the people of his land. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths like a stone into the raging waters. You led them by day with a pillar of cloud and by night with a pillar of fire to give them light in the way they were to go. So the last line, of course, is the most important one. What this is saying is that after we had become a family that was strong. We eventually became a nation, but that nation was trapped in Egypt in slavery. And so then God came and brought us out. But all of this description of our Egyptian time is very infantilizing. Indeed, you might compare the Jewish people to being like an infant at this point in our life. We had finally reached the point where we were born, when we came together as a family, and we are a toddler at best at this point. And God is doing everything for us. God is leading us out. God is splitting the sea. God is doing the signs and wonders. God is fighting our battles for us. God is leading us and protecting us. We needed that absolutely at that time, but that wasn't the goal. That wasn't the ideal. That isn't what God was doing with us. It wasn't just bringing us out so God could have a pet. It was specifically so that we would get to Mount Sinai. God brought us to Sinai as the purpose of our liberation. Right? I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord, your God. Right? God's purpose in the liberation was that we would be able to have a special relationship, which we're going to now know is brought through the giving of Torah, through the gift that we symbolize by the story of Sinai, what's called the theophany, the experience of God by the nation, so that they would feel bound to the covenant, the brit, they would be bound to the commandments, the mitzvot. In Nehemiah's word, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. You made known to them your holy Shabbat. You ordained for them laws, commandments, and teaching through Moses, your servant. You gave them bread from heaven, what we call manna, when they were hungry, and produced water from a rock when they were thirsty. You told them to go and possess the land that you swore to them. But they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. They stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. And this is going to become kind of the theme for the next little bit. Excuse me, let me turn that off. Which is the purpose of us being liberated is that God would be our God, but that relationship would be governed by the contract, the covenant of the Torah, and that would include a great many rules and regulations. Now, those rules and regulations were not meant to be burdensome. They were meant to be right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. And nowadays, people may not think about, laws ever being good, which is a shame in our modern world, because a good law is an amazing thing, because a good law helps you make a good society. It helps make so that there is less conflict between neighbors, less conflicts in business, less conflicts in any other aspect of your life. So this whole gift of Torah was meant to be a loving addition to our life, and the ability to then guide us of how to make good choices and live a good life. But unfortunately, we didn't exactly accept it like that. We instead complained, we instead rebelled, we instead continued to be stiff-necked, which is a euphemism for stubborn. Sort of imagine an animal when you're trying to pull its head and it's just pulling back the opposite way. If you've ever tried to ride a horse, you know what I'm talking about. So this then becomes the tension in our relationship. God is only trying to give us something that will be good and helpful and beneficial to us, and we are resisting because we don't like being told what to do. This is what's called being a teenager. Right? And like I said, Egypt, we were coming out as toddlers. Sinai, we are now teenagers. And we're going to go through our teenage tantrums. But like any good teenager, we're going to be both angry at God and also turning to God for help, because every teenager will shout at their parents and then ask for money for gas. It's just part of the relationship. And that brings us to the period what we call the judges, the Shoftim. Again, Nehemiah continues. The sons, meaning the people who came into the land of Israel, came and took possession of the land. You subdued the Canaanites inhabitants of the land before them. Right? God is still helping to fight our battles for us. You delivered them into the power of their adversaries and who oppressed them. But some of the fights are not going our way. In their time of trouble, they cried out to you. When we needed God, when we needed help, we went, God, please help us. You in heaven heard them, and in your abundant compassion gave them saviors, leaders, who saved them from the power of their adversaries. So we had all sorts of different generals. We had Gideon, we had Deborah and Barak, we had Samson, who wasn't so great. We had lots of great leaders who would help us. And then afterwards, when they had relief, they again did what was evil in your sight. So you abandoned them to the power of the enemies who subjugated them. Again, they cried out to you. and you in heaven heard and rescued them in your compassion time after time. Indeed, if you read the book of Judges, every chapter is basically people were doing wrong, they cried out, God helped them. People were doing well, then they did wrong again. Wash, rinse, repeat. It's just over and over this pattern is happening. Which is why it's no surprise that the people eventually said, we don't need momentary saviors and helpers. What we really need is a king. What we want is to have one person who will rule over us, and then they can make sure that everything goes right. Yeah, that's a good recipe. But that was what was going on around them. As we see from the book of Samuel, all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel, who at the time was the prophet and leader of the people, and they said to him, you've grown old, meaning you're going to die soon. And your sons have not followed your ways. Your sons, in fact, were corrupt and doing rather horrible things, which you can go read about. So appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Right? They wanted a king because that's what other countries had, and that seemed to work. Samuel was displeased that they said, give us a king to govern us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied, heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you, meaning basically give them a king. For it is not you they have rejected, it is me that they have rejected as their king. Right? God is supposed to be our king, and everyone else is sort of middle management. But trying to have a human king meant that the people really didn't understand that relationship. They were looking for someone else to stand between them and God, someone else to lead them, when really what God wanted was for us to lead ourselves, to be people of moral conscience that would choose right and wrong because God had already explained it to us in the gift of revelation through Torah. And then we wouldn't need to have anyone stand around with a spear poking us to do what was right. And because remember, that's what God didn't want to do. God didn't want to have the whole Noah thing. He didn't want to go around throwing lightning bolts. He wanted people to choose right and wrong. That's what makes us human all the way back in the story of Genesis. With me so far? Okay. So, like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Basically, Samuel, I know it hurts. I've been living this for a few hundred years. This is what the people are like. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. And Samuel points out that kings are not exactly a great thing to have, and that they're going to end up taking your money, they're going to end up taking your daughters and your sons. You sure you want this? And the people say, yeah, we really do. But this does set up a whole new line, because we now have Saul and David. We now end up with the first two kings. Saul was the first guy chosen, and he was deeply flawed as king, but his primary failing was not following God's commands. The king, according to Judaism, had to see himself as a servant of God, which is hard because most kings see themselves as being the top of the pyramid, not as the top of the human pyramid, but still way underneath God. Most kings want to get as close to be thinking of themselves as God as possible. This is what we see in the Egyptian, in the Babylonian, in the Assyrian, in the Persian world. Everybody who gets to a certain level of power starts calling themselves either descended from God, half God, or God, because that's how they feel. And compared to the other people around them, maybe that's what they thought. But compared to God, obviously they weren't. And Saul indeed starts making statues to himself and starts not following through on the commands that God gives him. So he gets replaced. It's more complicated than that, but we don't have time. So David becomes the new king, and David did a lot better. Now, he still made mistakes. David made quite a few mistakes. But when he made mistakes, he was sorry to God. He actually apologized. He actually asked for forgiveness. He admitted his own mistakes and sought to fix his mistakes. If you remember all the way back at the beginning of our story, that's what God wants. Right? That's what makes David an exceptional king, not just because he's mighty and all of that other stuff, but because he knows that he makes mistakes and he knows how to fix them. That is the model that God wants for a king. Now, David went on to write songs and psalms as well. However, his rule still had many problems, meaning both from within his nation as well as from outside the nation. All right. Before we get into Solomon, how are we doing so far? Okay, because we're moving into where it gets more complicated, where things really begin to start falling apart. I know it sounded like they were falling apart. It gets a lot worse here. So Solomon is chosen by David to be the next king. And again, there's a whole long story about how he ends up getting chosen. And once Solomon becomes king, we get the following story in the first book of Kings. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God asked, what shall I grant you? God is basically saying, tell me what you want. You young man who has just been made king. And Solomon said, you have dealt most graciously with your servant, my father David. And now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant, meaning me, king in place of my father, because my father's dead. But I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. In fact, his older brothers have been the ones who were probably going to be king, but they all ended up murdering themselves, each other, or getting killed because they tried to have rebellions. Your servant then finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours? Now, you got to admit, that is exactly the plot that the whole Bible has been working with. All we really want is to know between right and wrong. All we really want is to know how to do what is good. So give me that God. And so Solomon is obviously way up, 2 thumbs up. This is a good guy to be asking him to be king. And the Lord was pleased with that Solomon had asked for this. And God said to him, because you asked for this, I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you arise again. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David. So you'll notice that last part of the bonus stuff is going to come as a result of living that good life. And you're going to get wealth, and you're going to have a secure kingdom and all those other things. Of course, because if you're using your wisdom correctly, if you're using your intelligence to understand what is right and what is wrong, and you put that into practice, then you will end up with a much better life than if you hadn't. Doesn't mean that you're spared all the other troubles and problems that can arise. You're still going to get too much rain or too little rain. You're still going to have people attacking the borders or people trying to do different trade that you don't want to do. It's still going to be hard as a king, but you'll have an understanding of the right way to handle those situations, and that will lead you to a better result. So Solomon does a pretty good job until he gets old, right? Solomon was not a perfect king. He did pretty well for most of his kingdom, but in his later years, he had a problem. He expanded the kingdom more than was necessary, and he also brought in idolatry. He married an awful lot of women, not just from within the Jewish people, but also from other countries as part of his diplomacy. And that meant that when they arrived, they brought with them their idols, their idol worshiping. And Solomon began to join in because, if your wife asks you to worship an idol, who are you to say no? Obviously, he should have. He built a temple and many fortresses and palaces, but he also did this with forced labor of the people. Now, a little bit of forced labor was normal. That's what most people paid for taxes because they didn't have cash so much, but you could give a month's worth of work. They made them work a lot more than a month. And when Solomon finally died, the nation was quite upset with all of the stresses that they had been put under by Solomon. And so they looked for relief from his son Rehoboam, who becomes the new king. It doesn't work so well. They come to him and they say, your father, meaning Solomon, made our yoke heavy. Now, lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you. Right? This is what we would call the social contract in modern political philosophy language. The people are going to the leader and they're saying, look, you treat us fairly and we'll be good servants to you. We will serve you as the citizens of the country happily and productively. Rehoboam says, go away for 3 days and then come back to you. Basically the equivalent of, let me think on it. And King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders, meaning the official older leaders of the nation, and they answered him, if you will be a servant to the people and serve them, and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servants always. So this, again, is showing that there's meant to be a certain equality between king and the people. The king serves the people serve the king, and that mutual respect is what makes for a good country. But he ignored the advice of the elders, gave him into counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. So basically, he went with the advice of his drinking buddies. The guys from his, shall we say, disreputable frat house, right? Not the good people, but the other people. And he said back to the nation, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins, which is absolutely as rude as you may think that sounds. Right? Remember, loins is the part of the body used to make other human beings. So he's basically saying my little finger is bigger than my dad's. Absolutely rude, absolutely offensive, of course, horribly disrespectful. But what he's basically trying to say is, if you thought my dad was tough, wait till you see me, right? My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips. I will flog you with scorpions. Okay. We just failed in having a nation continue, because what happens is the country becomes divided. There becomes a northern kingdom of 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom, mostly of Judah, and a few remnants of the other tribes. And this becomes what's known as the divided monarchy, where you have two kings, one of what we call Israel, that becomes the name for the northern portion, and one for Judah, which is the name for the southern portion. And Judah is where Jerusalem is, so it still has the temple and it still has that history. And the northern portion is where the majority of the population live and where a majority of the economic productivity exists. So that becomes the wealthier section. But there's a problem. The northern kingdom doesn't have Jerusalem, so they begin to develop idolatry. They begin to develop their own worship of other gods alongside of God, alongside of Adonai. And that becomes a big problem. Many prophets show up and they warn the northern kingdom of Israel to cleave to God, to stick to God, but they worshiped idols and broke all rules of morality. So eventually, in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire completed their destruction of the northern kingdom and carried off the vast majority of the people to be scattered. They are now lost. Whenever you hear people talk about the lost tribes of Israel, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the people who were taken away by the Assyrians in 722, and we don't know where they went. They were literally scattered into the Assyrian Empire and beyond, and so they could be anywhere by now. There are lots of people out there who will, for a fee, promise to do your DNA test and tell you if you're part of the lost tribes. And it's called a scam, but such is the modern world. The southern kingdom, on the other hand, of Judah, lasted a little bit longer. It had a few more good kings, most notably Hezekiah and Josiah, but eventually it also fell, again, after many, many years of prophecy trying to warn it to change, and it fell in 586 BCE to the Babylonians after making a foolish alliance with Egypt, who then betrayed them. They shouldn't have been fighting against Babylon. God had told them through the prophets, it's okay, just go along with Babylon, still be Jewish, and the empire will pass. And they said, no, we're going to fight. And they fought and lost horribly. So 586 is the beginning of what is called the diaspora, the first diaspora. This is the first exile from Israel, because the Babylonians take a huge portion of the people and they take them to Babylon. So that should have been the end of Judaism. That should have been the end of the people of Israel. The northern tribes, you remember, once they were taken away by the Assyrians, gone to history. Once we're taken away in the southern kingdom, it should have been the end of the road as well. And in fact, if you go back through history and you look up all the different places that Babylon or Assyria conquered, you can just draw a line through all of them because those nations are gone. The places are still there, but the cultures and the religions and everything else that was those nations, they were wiped out by the Babylonians and Assyrians. So without a homeland, without a temple, we should have fallen apart. And many other nations did. But instead, now in Babylon, we built communities. And we used the Torah, we used the Psalms, remember, talked about, written many by David, and we built the mitzvot, the commandments, to bind us together to God and each other. This is the beginning of what we would now call a synagogue. A synagogue is technically a Greek word, so it's a little bit later than this, but this is where we begin to have these communities. People begin to congregations, in order to figure out, what did we do wrong? How do we fix this? What can we do better in the future? Hopefully you're picking up on that pattern. This was also a time when we adopted a Hebrew font, which was much easier to write. Great digression for another time. There used to be another script, another way of writing Hebrew than the one we currently use. It's terrible. And I'm really glad we switched. Then the Persians come along and they conquer Babylon. right? The Assyrians conquer the north, the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians and then us, the Persians conquer the Babylonians and free us. They allow us to then return. So this is 70 years after 586, after we were conquered by the Babylonians. The Persians beat them up, and they allow us to return to rebuild the temple, and we're still part of the Persian Empire, right? This is how it would have been if we had just not fought the Babylonians in the first place. We just go along with the empire. We still stay Jewish. We stay true to our own way, but we're just part of this larger group called the Babylonian or then later Persian Empire. Following the story so far? Okay. This then leads to a clash with the Greeks. I'm sure that you've all heard about the story of the Maccabees, and we're going to get to them in just a second. But we have to understand why the Maccabees were fighting Greek culture. And that was because the Persians, whose empire we were part of, eventually are invaded by the Greeks. Technically by the Macedonians, by Alexander the Great. But he had a Greek army, and he was championing Greek culture. So Alexander the Great comes through, and he destroys the Persian Empire and takes over it. And in the process, of course, he wins us. Because if you defeat the empire, you get the pieces of the empire. So we are now part of Alexander the Great's empire. But he dies in 323 BCE. And once he dies, his empire gets split up. And it gets split up into different pieces. The part that first gets us is called the Ptolemaic Empire, and that was based in Egypt and run by Ptolemy, his general. But after a lot of back and forth, eventually the Middle Asian part that was left over from his empire, known as the Seleucid Empire, it beats the Ptolemies and takes us away from them in 201 BCE. So we're following the story up to this point? Right? They're fighting back and forth between Egypt and Asia, and eventually we get pulled into the Asian piece. That piece then decides to start promoting Hellenism more strongly, this idea of Greek cultures and Greek ideas. And that is when you eventually get a guy who wants to change everything, called Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the guy who was the villain of the Hanukkah story. Right? He's the empire of the Seleucids. He is not Greek in the sense that he is not born in Greece, but he does follow Greek ideas and Greek culture. And that's what he thinks everyone should do. It's simpler for administration. We resist. In 168, the Jews revolt against this, and we fight back. There were Jews on both sides of that issue, I should point out. It was a bit of a civil war, not just us fighting the evil empire. But the Maccabees, which is the group that eventually won, and their supporters won independence for the first time since the Babylonians. Remember, 586, we get conquered. It's not until 168 BCE that we are an independent state again. All the years in between, we were serving one empire or another. But by 168, we eventually become free. And they controlled then a tiny kingdom that was around Judah. You can just sort of draw around Jerusalem. You can sort of draw a circle, and that's where they ended up being in charge. And they weren't really good kings, right? The Hashmoneans, the Maccabees, they were great fighters. They weren't great rulers. And this means that they didn't always get 100% of the freedom they wanted. And they also combined the kingship and priesthood into one family, which was kind of a problem. Separation of church and state is a good idea. So, as the Hashmoneans became more unsteady, two brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, two great Jewish names, right? Now, these are Greek names, so they're the descendants of the Maccabees who fought against Greek ideas end up having kids, great-grandkids, that are basically embracing Greek ideas. It's just what every grandparent wants to hear. So these guys are fighting for who's going to be the next king, and they each call Rome, who is the rising power in the Mediterranean, and they say, support me. Rome does eventually pick Hyrcanus as being the guy they want to use as their puppet, and so in 63 BCE, they formally take Judea as part of the Roman Empire, and basically that's the end to Jewish independence again. We are now part of another empire. In 37 BCE, Herod, known as Herod the Great, eventually becomes the king with Roman approval, and that meant officially the end of the Hashmonean dynasty. The Maccabee family was done because he killed them all. He was quite the butcher. He killed his own wife in order to wipe out any possible challenge from that family. The people didn't like the Roman control at all, and there were lots of troubles that eventually led to the official major revolt, which was in 66 to 70 CE. And this was when the Second Temple was destroyed. This is what is most powerfully, along with the First Temple's destruction, commemorated on Tisha B'Av, the holiday that I mentioned before that's going to be commemorated in a few weeks. So we're up to 70 CE. With me so far? It's going fast, right? We've only gone for about 2,000 years. We still got about 2,000 years to go. I'm not sure we're going to finish today. We'll see. So we have another revolt in 115 CE. Doesn't go so well. And then we get another revolt against the Romans in 132 to 135 CE. That one works better. That's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt because the leader of it was nicknamed Bar Kokhba, the son of a star. But it failed eventually. It was really successful to begin with, but eventually Rome brought legions all the way from England and they crushed the revolution. And when Rome gets mad, Rome gets nasty. And Rome decides that it is time to break the Jewish people in Israel once and for all. They put out harsh punishments and mass deportation of slaves. They institute new taxes and policies so that living in the land of Israel now becomes almost impossible for Jewish people. And that means that the majority of Jews leave. Either they leave as slaves or they leave willingly because of how hard this is. Now, there was already a lot of Jews living in Egypt and in Rome and in other parts of the empire before this. And of course, many were still living in Persia and Babylon during this time. But at this point, we now officially get sort of the great departure, what you might call the second great exile, the second great diaspora really begins. And there still is a community in Israel and it survives, but under rabbinic leadership, we see the Judaism that we are more familiar with finally take shape. And this is going to emphasize personal devotion, the performance of mitzvot, service to the community, deep study of texts to best be able to live the right life. This then becomes the model because the temple is gone, the king is gone, our independence is gone, our military power is gone. What's left? Us and God. And for that, we then structure our life to best manage that relationship so that us, meaning within our community, we can be strong and good for each other. And us and God, we and God can be good and strong and connected to each other without all of the other parts that go along with having a state. So this stateless period then becomes the new normal for the next almost 2,000 years until 1948 officially, when Israel becomes a state again. Which we talked about in a previous class. With me? Okay. So during this period, now that Rome has taken over and that we are beginning to disperse, we get a number of very important books that are being written. We talked about these in the very, very first class, or maybe second class, but you need to see them in context here. So the early Midrashim, the early interpretations of the Torah, as part of the chain of tradition, those become written down. They had been always discussed and taught teacher to student orally. Now they are being collected and published, if you will, in a printed form. The Mishnah, which we study on Wednesday nights, the Mishnah is also being written. And again, this is collecting the clearest teachings of the law as practiced. So the Torah, as we talked about in previous classes, gives us the bedrock, the foundation, the basic pillars of what we are meant to do, but we need the details if we're going to put it into practice. And the Mishnah is where you find those details of how do you actually do this? Not just, return lost property, but what counts as lost, what counts as return, how long do I have to do it? All of those details are where the Mishnah is giving us the guidance we need to turn the Torah into an actual community. And it had been around before this, but now it's being officially collected in order that people can have the memorized or printed version of it, no matter where they end up around the world. And this is what's going to be important because as the Jewish population becomes global, we need to have these books with us, or else Jews in Yemen and Jews in Morocco and Jews in England and Jews in Poland are going to end up looking completely different. Because if we all use different traditions and different books to guide us of how to live the Torah, then there's not going to be any unity of the people in our belief and practice. We're not going to be unified in location, but we can be unified at least in how we live our lives. And that's how you end up with all the different communities around the world still being remarkably similar despite 2,000 years of dispersion. So far, so good. Byzantium. Everyone likes to skip over this, but it was really, really important. You may have heard about the fall of Rome. When people talk about the fall of Rome, they mean the fall of Western Rome, the actual city of Rome. Eastern Rome in Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's called now, this went on for a long time, and this was, of course, responsible for ruling over the area that was Israel at the time. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to rule, even as the Western Empire declined. Though things were more stable, life was becoming harder for Jews in Israel, more left. There were a couple of times when it looked like the empire might be coming nicer to us, but it didn't. And during this time, the debates and discussions of the Mishnah were begun to be written down to help answer the deeper questions. Those written answers became what we now call the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi. So remember, the Mishnah was the oral law to explain how to live the written law, and the Talmud, or the Gemara, as you might also hear it called, was written in order to further understand the Mishnah so that we would be 100% sure we were living in correct accordance with the Torah. In Old Babylon, what was called Persia at the time, the Jews who remained in Persia at the end of exile continued to thrive, and they were joined by many Jews from the West. So many Jews who left Israel went to Europe or North Africa. Many others went east and went into what we now call Iraq and Iran. They were huge and very, very important and the center of Jewish life for centuries. They built great academies, and generally they got on pretty well with the non-Jewish neighbors around them. This led to the formation of the Babylonian Talmud, which is sort of Talmud version 2, and is considered to be the more authoritative book within Judaism than Talmud version 1, the Jerusalem Talmud. And this version of the Talmud is the last universally accepted book in Judaism. Every other book that's written after this, and we're now at about the year between 500 and 700 CE, every book after that is basically a type of commentary on all of the things that came before. And commentaries you can pick and choose. Not everyone agrees with every commentary, which is why there are so many footnotes in Judaism. The Gaonim were the leaders who came near the end of that period, and they were the main authorities for world Judaism. People would send letters all the way from Spain, all the way into Turkey, or all the way into Iraq to get answers. But communication was breaking down as the Roman Empire and the Byzantium Empire went down. And that meant that the communities around the world were left more and more on their own to develop more and more themselves for how they would live and answer these questions. In Europe, now we're back in the West. Jews had already come to Europe, as I mentioned, in early Roman times, before the wars and before the diaspora, but more came as the centuries went on. During the Dark Ages, officially called the Dark Ages, Jews actually had mixed experiences. They weren't so dark for us. We were not bound into that feudal system of king, knight, or king, lord, knight, peasant. We were outside that system. And that also meant we weren't protected by it. So we didn't owe allegiance, and we also didn't have complete independence. We often could not own land, but we did have better merchant channels than many of our non-Jewish neighbors. There was not much religious hostility during this period. That meant that Europe became an attractive place for many Jewish communities. And Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, actually encouraged Jews to settle in his area of the empire in the middle of Europe. He recognized in Jews a lot of advantages, many of them being that we had connections with other Jews around the world, and that was very useful for an empire. Islam comes along in 610. In 610 CE, Islam starts under Muhammad. We're back in the East now. And as it wrestles for dominance in Arabia, many Jewish groups are bullied and attacked. Jews were seen as potential allies by Muhammad at first, but when we refused to convert to Islam, we were then seen as enemies to his rising religion. Islam eventually prevails in Arabia and begins to spread through conquest and conversion. Sometimes it was forceful, sometimes it was voluntary. Many people around the world did like Islam when it showed up, compared to the idolatrous religions that it was replacing. In 637, Islam captures Jerusalem, and they then begin to let Jews return to the city, but enforce what was called the Pact of Omar, which states that Jews cannot build new synagogues, they cannot pray loudly, and they cannot stop Jews from converting to Islam. So if you have a brother and he wants to become Muslim, you're not allowed to tell him that he shouldn't. And if you do so, you can be punished for trying to stop someone from becoming Muslim. We also couldn't hold legal posts, and we had to wear yellow stars in order to be identified within that community. So we were given some good treatment, but we were second-class citizens at best. This would depend upon who was in charge. That's why I like to call it, there was the golden age of Islam, and there was also the lead of Islam. It went back and forth. So from the beginning, there were tensions between Islam and Judaism, as I mentioned, but we were more often at peace with each other than we were with Christian rulers. That is to say, there was usually more harmony between Jewish and Muslim communities than there were between Jewish and Christian communities, or Muslim and Christian communities. And when Islam became more rationally oriented through philosophy and science, remember, algebra came to us through the Muslims, Judaism thrived. And we went right along with that golden age of thinking and discovery, and we created many great Jewish poets, scientists, and philosophers. This is often called the golden age of Judaism. Local conditions, however, really depended on the local rulers, and not all consistently supported Jewish life. So you might have a good ruler in Morocco, and you might have a bad ruler in Spain. You might have a good ruler in Egypt and a bad ruler in Tunisia. It depended upon where you were during these centuries and who was in charge of your local community, of whether it was a happy time or a not so happy time. But compared to what was going to happen in Europe, this definitely looked a lot better, because in Europe, things begin to go bad. The Crusades. The Pope begins the Crusades in 1095. And a lot of different reasons given for why the Crusades were begun. It might have been trying to recapture the Eastern Catholic Church. It might have been trying to expand European trade routes. It might have just been a way to get rising tensions of Europe to blow off steam somewhere else and go conquer lands over there. But it didn't really matter for us, because it was bad for whatever the reason. Tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in Europe because they decided to practice killing people with us before they got to the Muslim lands. And 1,000 more in Israel were also killed by the Europeans after they conquered Jerusalem. Thousands were forced to convert or flee, and rising militant piety in Europe became a new factor to deal with. Judaism begins also to lose its merchant advantage as the European powers begin to dominate the trade routes across the Mediterranean. And at the same time, distrust of outsiders begins to rise as well. And by rise, I mean both within the Jewish communities and also from other communities. This becomes where there is more tension of Jews being outside of Christian Europe, that we may live in Germany, but we're not really one of them. This begins to be a new problem developing at this time period. The earlier centuries, that had not been such an issue. Yes, we were outside the feudal system, but we weren't seen as being this infection. This now begins, just to begin, this kind of thinking, which will eventually continue all the way up until the Holocaust as one of Europe's great problems. And we're going to have to stop there because it's 7 o'clock and I have another meeting. Okay, so we only got to the Crusades. I will do a little bit more next week, as well as also talk about the 3 weeks and the coming commemoration of Tisha B'Av. Take care and keep studying.
Yes, thank you.
Somehow I didn't think we were going to quite